Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Morning and welcome back to the Koala podcast. Today I'm talking to Ryan Douglas, a commercial cultivator and consultant based in Maine. Very nice part of the world indeed. And he was the head grower at Cannabis, so that's a serious head grower, and has published an ebook called "Presence is a Strategy: The Competitive Advantage You Can't Automate." Ryan, welcome to the Koala podcast. I always ask at the beginning, what brought you into the world of commercial or regulated cannabis? Were you a grower beforehand, or did you come out of agricultural tertiary education and move into cannabis cultivation?
I did, and thank you for having me on the show, Sean. So before cannabis, I spent 15 years growing ornamental crops in greenhouses across the U.S. And then once it slowly became decriminalized here in the U.S., I kind of transitioned a different crop, but really essentially the same kind of work.
When you moved into cannabis, were you in the sort of, did you do that, what, 2015, 16, that sort of period? Or what years were you moving in, and what did it seem a bit amateur at that time compared to ornamental, basically, is what I'm trying to get to.
Hey, that's a great word to use. So we're talking 2012, 2013, when
Okay,
I
so
was
quite
recruited
early in
by
the game.
Canopy.
Yeah.
Right. And so the challenge at that time was converting a former Hershey chocolate factory into one of the first federally licensed medical cannabis facilities in Canada.
There weren't the plethora of consultants and advisors, and I mean, I presume the people with the most knowledge were either still working in what they like to call the underground, or had come from business, from areas of agriculture like yourself.
Exactly. And so there was a ton of, cannabis or kind of grow experts who on one side were kind of telling me, well, you've just got to do what we're doing here in our grow room and just
But I was about
basically
to
build
say,
a thousand.
look, I'm not, I've never been a grower. I've grown at home and all this sort of stuff, and I'm not a scientist. And I've always got the sense from those. This is really interesting for me because those cannabis growers remind me a lot of the type of people I would identify as Silicon Valley type tech people, where that we have the knowledge and we are right about anything, and there's no other way to do it because they've done it in their way for so long. And I presume it's quite a struggle to explain to them how to do things in a different way if you're moving into a more commercial world.
Right. You think about most of the expertise at that time, um, they were relatively small grow ops, and a lot of what they did was to avoid detection. And so now, for the first time, it's legal on a federal level, and there's not a risk of going to prison. But how do you scale up that kind of underground or illicit market knowledge to the scale of something, you know, inside of a
And
Hershey
and
chocolate
and I
factory?
presume the dichotomy between the complete lack of knowledge of senior management and then the people on the cannabis cultivation with you in the middle uh, must have been quite a few headaches, I should have imagined.
Sure. Yeah. So you have kind of advice from the illicit world, the underground growers on one side, and then the other side, kind of commercial floriculture and commercial vegetable production. But, cannabis isn't exactly a poinsettia, but we've got to find a way to scale it up so we're not just building a thousand, kind of closet grow rooms inside of a warehouse.
Well, and also, I mean, management at companies like Canopy, especially in that period, I mean, they know about money, but they're absolutely clueless about the product, I presume.
Right. So I think that's part of the reason I was hired because I came from traditional horticulture, commercial scale growing in the US. And it was simply a matter of transferring those principles, even though the crop was different, 80 to 90% of growing a crop on a commercial scale, it's all the same game. It's that last 10% or so is specific to the crop because you can't treat cannabis the same way you treat tomatoes or the same way you treat
Yeah.
flowers. But when you step back, a lot of the process is the same.
Did you find yourself creating the rules as you went along because they hadn't been created before? And how was did you have to interface with regulatory? This is sort of interesting. Did you have to interface with regulatory authorities to explain to them about something that they were completely unaware of? Because that was the story of cannabis across the board, all the way up to when we could say about 2019, 2020, I suppose, a whole decade of trying to explain how everything worked, not just to your senior management, but also the people sent by regulatory authorities and their bosses, and then the people that they report to sitting in the legislature who just, their knowledge is non-existent on the crop.
Right. So instead of setting up a grow facility in the most efficient way possible, we had to work backwards. We had to understand the regulatory framework and then work backwards to set up a cultivation facility that fulfilled those requirements and didn't run afoul of the law.
Which must have made your money people very happy indeed. Not.
Well, yeah, I mean, it just made things more expensive. I mean, right off the bat, we were not allowed, we could grow in a greenhouse, but we couldn't operate it as a greenhouse. So you could put plants in a greenhouse, but there were laws like you couldn't have vents that opened. So it's like saying you can operate a vehicle, but you just can't use the wheels. So it just made more sense to grow inside of a warehouse and follow the regulations than try to for example, use a greenhouse, which is an inexpensive way to grow a crop, but we simply weren't allowed to do it. So we had to follow the rules and then work backwards and engineer the production system so we didn't get ourselves into trouble and kept the license.
And as a grower who the most important thing for you is making sure the best product comes out at the end. Did you find that although you had to reverse engineer it and you do the best job you can, were did you feel as though you were creating the best product for the market that you could at the time? How, if we looked at percentages, how far along the line do you think you were to producing what you wanted to produce because of all those roadblocks that were put in the way?
So the biggest challenge we had was in starting with quality plant material. So at that time, there was a lot of pushback to kind of the corporatization of cannabis from home growers in the illicit market. So it was almost impossible to come by healthy, verified clones of outstanding cultivars. And so, as an American going to Canada and as the investment group of Canopy at that time, we didn't have a lot of connections with the illicit cannabis world. So we didn't have connections for those genetics. So my only choice was to start from seed. And it's a much longer process of kind of identifying and refining. And so, I mean, that takes several months. And so kind of the price you pay is the initial harvest, should you choose to sell them, isn't really the most refined, highest quality flower, just because,
You were,
in cannabis.
and then the other question at that time, because there were, as the states in the US brought in legislation, I'm asking because I don't know in Canada, they created that sets of rules as, oh, you can grow cannabis, but buying seeds is illegal. Did you have those sorts of issues as well? So you were having to sort of source seeds from probably from contacts that you'd rather not, but you're operating in a permanent gray area whilst trying to create systems.
It was a bit of immaculate conception. I mean, it was 13 years ago, so I forget the exact rules, but the problem was even if we made some inroads and found people with excellent genetics that were willing to sell those to us or license them to us, almost everything I came across was infected with some kind of a disease or an insect. And so you bring in these fresh clones into a state-of-the-art facility, and in theory, a couple months later, you would have everything infested with whatever insects or disease were on those plants. So even if it was a really killer strain, I just couldn't use it. I couldn't permit it to enter the facility because I knew what would happen a couple months down the road. So another reason for starting fresh from seed, but it's certainly not the most efficient way to start.
You struggled through and went through that process, I presume, with what that's half a decade's worth of work. Um, when did you feel as though not just you, but the growing market on the industrial scale or the larger scale began to sort of settle down and and have some sort of formulation or structure to it?
Well, probably after I left Canopy. So I stayed with them for about 3 years before I ventured out on my own as a consultant. But I think it's not until there were more licenses and more cultivation sites and much more production and activity in Canada did that happen. But during my time there, it was still really very few producers on a commercial scale that were growing and selling. But I think once I left, though, the industry just continued to grow, and we finally reached that level. But by that time, I was outside of Canada.
So I'm sorry to keep you in the past. Everything is cut by COVID essentially, and the cannabis industry to me seemed one thing before COVID, and then a lot of stuff happened during COVID that was quite quiet, and then it came out the other side. During that period, there was, yeah, everybody was at home. They were smoking a lot of weed, so there was a lot of cannabis being grown. What I'm really interested in that period in the middle where there might have not been so much oversight of the industry whilst it was making a lot of money. How did you see that in as a consultant or as a grower during that period?
So, two answers. One is in Canada, there was always oversight. So the regulatory body was always making unannounced audits. So there was never a pause in oversight. But during that time, I was working with international investors in South America who were looking for low-cost producers for export. So during COVID, in those years, I was in Colombia. They had just recently instituted a legal cannabis cultivation and export program. So we had a
Yep.
lot of international investors looking to set up shop there. So I was busy during COVID setting up cultivation sites and doing due diligence for M&A acquisitions opportunities in Colombia.
And in terms of how the setup of those sort of operations, was it loose and fast, or was it actually quite specific because people wanted to keep to costs? Again, you've done a lot of work in different places. What created the structures in, I suppose you could look at it as a phase two in terms of understanding how to grow cannabis on a larger scale?
Actually, in Colombia at that time, it was relatively slow. There was a lot of regulatory hurdles, much more so than in Canada. But at that time, the name of the game was buying and selling licenses. And so there was a lot of kind of fever, maybe it kind of poured over from Canada, but because there was a lot of excitement and people thought, wow, we could grow, for less than a penny a gram and then sell it for, $4,000 a pound in another country. Everyone was really excited. So once licenses started to change hands, that was the game. Very few people were actually focused on creating a long-term business that was efficient and
Well, I mean,
it was
you look at places like Oregon and Washington during that period. I mean, just the overproduction was just completely out of control and almost trashed the entire market, didn't it?
from my understanding, yeah, I haven't lived there, but I've read plenty about what has happened there. But yeah, so it was exciting in Colombia, but people, when you think about selling the license, it doesn't matter where the facility is located or what the weather is like or what the plan is. It's just as long as on paper you have the paper license, now you've got something you could sell for a minimum of, 7 million up to 60 million.
Okay, so I mean, let's move on to the book. I just wanted to sort of give a little bit of background in terms of because a lot of people in the growing part of the industry know all this, but it's sort of fairly blank for the rest of us. So it's sort of quite interesting to have a few insights. You've written the book, and presence is a strategy. Do you want to give us a little bit more insight into that particular phrase, presence is a strategy? Is that essentially all your management should be on the ground the whole time and actually understand what is happening, like any business, rather than just helming the ship from a distance?
Exactly. Exactly. So I wrote that book because we're in an age where there's so much technology and so many options for automation, and AI is infusing itself into every aspect of our life. There's a real risk that operators can get caught up behind the screen and lose touch with what's happening in the greenhouse or in the grow room, which is where the work really happens. And so, as you know, Sean, in the US, the name of the game here is operational efficiency because you've got so much competition, compressed margins, right? It's all about how do we stay competitive. And in my 30 years in commercial plant cultivation, the greatest insights I've had into improving margins never came to me through any kind of a software alert or any kind of technology. They came from showing up and being present consistently in the grow up.
Well, as I look, I grew up in the country in the UK, so my first jobs were always in agriculture as the,
Yeah.
you know, as the 15-year-old who crawled along picking something or grafting something. I mean, how difficult is it to explain to people in suits, to use a better term, that you actually have to know about plants a little bit? That's the business you're in. Is it's a plant, and they do seem to think it's a ready-made Coca-Cola can rather than nature. Is that a really difficult thing to explain to them?
It is, especially for investors that are not from our world of plant production, because buying technology or buying equipment is always an easy solution, right? Because it feels like you're making progress. You can see it, you can take pictures of it, but the reality is the stuff that
It's like those
really
trade
moves in.
shows, isn't it? They always have some
Yeah.
new bizgangle wangle thing that only makes sense to eight people, but it is you wonder how it connects to the actual act of growing a plant and harvesting it.
And technology is only going to amplify what's already there. And so if you have a team that's kind of disconnected or unskilled or unmotivated, buying new technology is only going to amplify that problem. It's going to end up being an expensive waste of money. But on the contrary, if you have a team that's motivated and passionate and you've got a grow up that's really dialed in, then a lot of this, new technology can be genuinely useful. But you just can't run a grow up from behind a screen. And I think it's a real risk here in the US because we're going to continue to see consolidation, in my opinion. And you're going to have fewer and fewer people making decisions for more and more grow sites. And I think the greater the distance is from those decision makers and the actual people doing the work, the greater risk there is for
And that's look,
for damage.
that's the standard misunderstanding between senior management and people who work on the ground in any industry in this sort of hyper industrialized world that we live in. Again, when I was young, the other jobs I did was work in warehouses, and the guy would come in once every 2 weeks and look at you witheringly, but not actually understand what you're doing at all. And how in terms of recruitment, because we're talking about biology here, we got human beings and plants, and to create something, a product, let's call it, that people want. And it seems that there's a big disconnect between the offices of the money people and the actual plant growing and the people who are involved in that create the consumer generally, not always, but it's probably a bit more clued into cannabis than if they were, than any consumer buying a tomato or something. They'll just buy any tomato in the supermarket, and if it's no good, they'll just throw it away and go and buy another one. But here, cannabis, if it's not good, they're not going to buy it again. They'll go look for something else, won't they?
Well, absolutely. But you touched on an excellent point that this theme applies really to any industry. Cultivation has been my world for 3 decades, so that's why I speak about it. But I'm sure in anyone that's listening in other industries, I mean, the biggest place I've seen it is in HR initiatives, really tone deaf HR initiatives that are created by someone in a corner office in a building in another state, really far away from that grow site. And even if the purpose is good, when you have that kind of a distance, the risk for damage is almost too great. So when we talk about presence, it's not that you have to get rid of HR. It's that I think HR should work in service of the operation, not against it. So before they start creating initiatives, they really need to actually be in that greenhouse or in that grow room
But
and
it's
work
the
shoulder to shoulder.
old-fashioned idea, and I'll throw in an old family thing here. Is my former father-in-law now passed away. He ended up running credit unions worldwide, but he started as the 13-year-old who lit the fire in the early 1940s in the bank every morning for the manager. And it's almost that, isn't it? That everybody involved in the company, doesn't matter who they are, really needs to spend at least a month or two off and on, or for an extended period of time, on the factory floor, to use a old parlance, and understand what it is they're actually getting paid for each week, because in the end that's the product. They're not getting paid for what they're well, they're digital shuffling rather than paper shuffling these days, but they're not getting paid for that. They're getting paid because somebody is buying the stuff that comes out of that greenhouse.
And the real risk is, if you're not there on a consistent basis, if you're managing based on what you see on a screen or on a report or what people tell you, it's very possible you're actually managing an illusion. You're managing a version of the business that doesn't exist. And like I said at the outset, the greatest insights I've gained into improving margins came from getting out of the office and into the grow room or the greenhouse.
And
And
the
I've had
question is,
management team.
to your experience at the moment in the US, now it's grown to this stage, and they're all buying each other, and they're buying each other's licenses, and I hate that word consolidation, but you know, we know the three or four really big companies, and then the 20 company. Are they actually doing this, or are they so busy doing quarterly reports and all this sort of stuff, that they're not really paying attention? And does is that going to leave a space for a whole new type of cannabis business that understands these issues? Because I'm really interested in SME type companies and cannabis. I don't know, we're probably 3.0 or 4.0, where they're newer, smaller companies who are more nimble and have more understanding of the relationship between the plant, the grower, and the consumer.
Well, yeah, that's always been the case. I mean, being smaller and more agile, we're still humans at the end of the day, and that personal connection means a lot. But for those larger companies, I think cannabis is entering an environment where commercial greenhouse growers of flowers and vegetables have operated for decades, which is a very low margin industry with fierce competition. And what we don't have here in the US, but flower growers and vegetable growers have always had, is pressure from international global imports. So for the moment, for the time being, we're just fighting amongst
Yeah, well,
ourselves,
it's
kind of
interesting because I've just been
interstate
in
there.
South
But
Africa putting on the conference, and I went for a drive up the coast, and you know, and living on the south coast of England where I grew up, and going to Holland, you see that industry just it's gone completely global. It's everywhere, even here in Indonesia. You just drive out of town, and you see the same model all over the planet, but being able to produce it at the lowest possible cost. So, I mean, in the US, um, I think not so much in Canada, you can tell me more, but in the US, I find they think they're going to be really struggling with cost against what can happen in other markets. I mean, you go to the supermarket in the UK, and most of the product comes from Kenya, and so if they can absorb the transport costs in Europe, they can definitely do it for the US. So they're going to be struggling in a few years' time, aren't they?
well, I mean, nobody can really tell the future, but I mean, the best we can do is to run our operations as efficiently as possible, regardless of what the government is going to do or kind of what kind of external pressures,
Or
because we
not
can't
going to
control the
do
market.
is probably the case.
Yeah, we can't control what happens in the market. We can only control what happens in our own business. And the truth is, what really makes the difference that's going to make or break a business, it's not very sexy at all. It's the day-to-day decisions that are made inside that greenhouse. And any kind of self-inflicted wounds or friction or drag the company creates on its own is just gonna kill it. And one place I've seen it often is in high turnover in the cannabis industry, because if you go through the work of identifying and recruiting and hiring and onboarding and paying the best you can for the very best people, at the very least you want them to stay. But too often, what I've seen in my experience is you have management that drives them out the door. They drive their best people out the door through, either intimidating or kind of disrespectful management styles. And the very best people, they leave quietly and they leave first. They don't put up a big fuss or try to change the company culture because they know they can't. It's not their job. They just leave and they find somewhere else to go where they're better appreciated. And right now, growers have a lot of options in the cannabis industry and they're taking them. So when you talk about self-inflicted wounds, that cost of high turnover is a self-inflicted wound.
So, looking forward, do you think that the industry is young enough to learn to change, or do you think that they're going to struggle because it's all that normal thing? Investors invested, they need their money back, that the markets say this, etc., etc. From what I'm hearing from you, it's sort of a bit of a fine balance at the moment.
The answer is to run an efficient, successful commercial operation. They already exist in what I would call a sister industry. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just look to what commercial flower growers and vegetable growers are already doing. But I think for new licensees in new states, the key is to not to assume that the conditions are going to stay the same. Like if there's 5 or 8 or 15 licenses in a state, you shouldn't raise money based on the idea that it's always going to stay that way. You should raise money based on the idea there's going to be 400 licenses in 2 years. And that should really drive how you structure the business and how you raise money and where that money goes. And again, it all comes down to operational efficiency, not heroics, not an amazing master grower or, buying fertilizer with really sexy labels, right? Because vegetable growers don't do that. They make their own
And
fertilizer.
do you see there's a balance between these bigger multi-state operators and more SME state operators operating together as we move forward, or because of all these issues? Or do you, in that push and pull, how, if I ask, I ask you to put a cap on and say, look at it in 10 years' time, are we going to see in 10 years' time, in terms of the types of companies who are vertically integrated or managing grow sites around the country, are we going to be seeing less of them in the big end of town and more of the smaller, smarter, sharper companies who might invest more in their people and understanding the process of making the best product from the plant? Because you know better than I that there's a whole lot more products to come out of the cannabis plant that we're not aware of yet until science tells us.
Yeah, so I think it's gonna more closely resemble most industries where you've got a handful of really dominant players, but then you also have smaller regional players. And like I said, we're still humans at the end of the day, and I want to go somewhere where I know about the product and it's local and I know the people and I feel good about buying it. But I'm not representative of everybody. And if somebody wants to go and get the least expensive cannabis they can buy and they don't care where it comes from,
They're
someone
going to
needs
do
to
that.
meet that
Yeah.
demand. Yeah.
And I mean, and you said you worked in Colombia, you've worked in Canada, you've worked in the States. Here's a question. Wi- if you were starting a cannabis business to grow and you wanted it, the idea of your perfect cannabis growing business, would you start it in North America or would you start it somewhere else? Where do you think people understand in terms of being a producer and a distributor? Which countries do you think do it really, really well?
Well, it would make the most sense to go where the environment is ideal for growing, the cost of production is low, but you want to source the genetics from wherever in the world it's
So,
the best.
what, you're
That's
off
really
to
the recipe for
Pakistan?
success. I'm sorry?
You're off to Pakistan?
Hey, if it checks the boxes.
Well, no, it's interesting because I had a conversation with a filmmaker recently who was there, and quietly, there's a few organizations, he said, he couldn't say any names, who are quietly doing a lot of buying in, that and similar parts of the world. There are contracts being made, for future production, but it's all sort of fairly behind the velvet curtain at the moment. So it's sort of interesting to have this conversation because obviously people are looking for efficiency, but I'm not sure they know how to get there in a way that benefits both their workers and their consumers.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't I'd have to you'd have to see what the quality of stuff coming out of Pakistan is once it lands in the US, what the price
Well,
point
we'll
is, and
see. Okay, give us a little bit of, we haven't got long to go. Where can we get the ebook and the full title again?
presence is a strategy, the competitive advantage you can't automate, and you can find that on Amazon.
Okay, and it's a freebie download, or there's a little payment involved.
It's not free, but it is an ebook.
Okay, that's good. And are you gonna be working on a new book soon? Have you got any other ideas that you're thinking
I
about?
am. I am. My next book is going to be how to evaluate novel decisions in kind of the controlled environment agriculture space. So things like growing saffron or wasabi or any kind of specialty crops that we typically import from other
Oh, I'll
countries.
interview you. I'll interview you about that. That's far more interesting than cannabis. I'd love to know about how you grow saffron in that sort of environment, or or wasabi. That's fascinating. Ryan, thank you very much for being on the Karma Koala podcast. Sorry if I'm not up to knowledge base on the growing side, but hopefully, well, I know I've learned something, and I hope the listeners have learned something from the show as well.
No, it's been great. Thanks for having me on.
Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it. So, I mean, how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, great, Barry, a reefer.